So Dr. Steve Skinner, who's the director of the Greenwood Genetic Center. Dr. Skinner did his medical training at NUSC in Charleston. He then did residencies in family practice and pediatrics in Columbia, and his genetics training here at GGC. And he's been with GGC for many years and has been the director since 2011. So Dr. Skinner is going to talk about the universe of structural birth defects.
Thank you, David. First, let me say I am not an expert in birth defects. I appreciate Dr. Stevenson inviting me to give this talk. It gave me an opportunity to look at some literature I have not looked at in a long time. And also will say that Dr. Stevenson gave me the title of this talk, that this is what you're talking about. So I figured I should look at the title. There's probably a reason he selected the title, and what does he want me to talk about? He's pretty intentional with what he does. So let's look at the title. First, universe. That's all things, pretty broad, all-encompassing. I said, okay, 15 minutes, I got to talk about all things of birth defects. I took a different approach. I said, well, everything's in the universe, so I can talk about anything and everything, and that's what I'm going to do. I'll just talk about what I want to, which is in the universe, and I won't cover all things. So hopefully we'll get through in the 15 minutes. Then he put the word structural in there, and I said, well, there must be a reason. Structural refers to abnormalities in the development of body parts, cleft lip, split hand, split foot, heart defect. But the reason I guess it's there is that there are other types of birth defects that I really didn't think about, and those are functional birth defects. So certainly there are metabolic disorders that I didn't really think of as birth defects, I guess, until I was kind of reading through this, and as well as neurodevelopmental birth defects that present sometimes at birth with encephalopathies, but don't have structural abnormalities, at least that we see outwardly. You could say, well, all of these are structural birth defects if you look at the gene level or the cellular level, but for this talk and for most of the work that the CDC is doing and other states are doing as far as birth defects, they're looking at physical structural body parts you can see. And then the word birth, and that seems pretty obvious, but then I got to think about it. It's present at birth, but many of these, as you'll see in the next talk, are identified before birth by ultrasound or other techniques. So birth defects certainly show up before birth, and they can actually be not identified until after birth. So particularly, say, a unilateral absence of a kidney might not be found until adulthood, incidentally, if there's no reason to be doing ultrasounds or other imaging studies. So we talk about birth defects, but to get the true prevalence, we really have to look at a broad range of time for that. So I hope that's the intent, Roger, that you had when you assigned that title to. So just a few things on structural birth defects. It can be, the term birth defects in the literature and when you're talking to most physicians and family members is used interchangeably with congenital anomaly, congenital malformation. They kind of lump those together, they don't make a lot of differentiation. Then Dr. Hall will spend a lot of time talk about malformations and deformations and disruptions, and geneticists really like to spend a lot of time talking about those different words and terms. Malformations, basically more of an intrinsic abnormality or development of the organ from the very beginning. And so the organ never develops or never develops normally. Whereas deformations and disruptions, deformations, the organ and tissue is normally developing, and then something, usually some kind of outward mechanical force, misshapes the developing organ. So typically you might have decreased amniotic fluid or in utero constraint that causes a bending of a lower limb or a foot, or it might cause a deformation. Those usually have a different etiology and a different prognosis and treatment approach. And then disruptions, again, you have normally developing tissue or organs that are then disrupted, usually by some external force, and the classic example is amniotic bands, where the amniotic bands will cut through a tissue and either cause an amputation or clefting or things like that. Geneticists and dysmorphologists like to spend a lot of time looking at those because it gives us some clues to the timing of the birth defect or the underlying mechanism. But when you look at the literature and talk to most physicians and families, they're going to kind of use the term birth defects, congenital malformations, anomalies interchangeably. Now, birth defects have a significant impact on the individual and on society. They're common. They occur in about 1 in 33 births, so 3% of live births have identified, and these are basically major structural birth defects we're talking about here. Just to kind of put that in perspective, we hear a lot about autism and the autism epidemic, and 2 years ago, it was 1 in 68 children were identified with autism spectrum disorder. Now it's 1 in 59, but still, birth defects 1 in 33. So we don't hear as much talking about the epidemic of birth defects, I guess, even though it's much more prevalent. And we also talk about autism as being very heterogeneous, that's one of the problems, I guess, with birth defects. It's quite heterogeneous. I mean, in South Carolina, we're screening for over 50 different types of birth defects. So usually birth defects are looked at individually based on the organ system or the organs involved. But just to give you an idea of what the impact of this, it's about 120,000 live births with a birth defect, major birth defect in the U.S. annually, and about 1,800 every year in South Carolina with a major structural birth defect. And it has a significant impact also on mortality. So leading cause of infant death, so children 1 year or younger in this country are from birth defects, so 20% of infant deaths occur from birth defects. And worldwide, it's a significant cause of neonatal deaths in the first 28 days of life. It's the 4th leading cause of neonatal deaths worldwide. And these are old numbers as far as the financial impact, I guess. I didn't find any new ones, so I'm sure the numbers are much higher. And this is only on hospital stays, not on outpatient management and other impacts of the birth defects. But I think it was about 6 years ago in the U.S., there were over 139,000 hospital stays every year just associated with the birth defect and evaluation, management, and treatment of that, and over $2.6 billion in hospital costs per year. And I'm sure those numbers are much higher now. So it has a significant impact both on the individual, the family, but also on society as well. I mentioned already birth defects can be detected before, at, or after birth. So that's significant, I guess, when particularly you're looking at surveillance programs and how do you ascertain all the birth defects. Most occur, it makes sense, in the first trimester of the pregnancy, and that's when organs are developing and forming, so most of them occur in that time period. But organs continue to grow and develop, or at least some do after birth, so birth defects can occur in the second and third trimester. Significantly higher prevalence in spontaneous pregnancy losses and stillborn, so when we're talking about 3%, very underreported if you look at all spontaneous pregnancy losses and stillbirths, so much higher prevalence of birth defects. 12% of babies with one major birth defect have another major birth defect, and that starts making us think about etiology, and is this a syndrome or some mechanism that we can identify and help us to understand more about the cause of birth defect. And babies with birth defects are twice as likely to be born prematurely, so it has a significant impact on pregnancy outcome as well. Now, the cause of birth defects, about 40% we can determine the cause. So that means the majority of the time we cannot determine the cause of birth defect. And at the Greenwood Center, we've been spending a lot of time thinking about understanding the causes of intellectual disability, birth defects, and autism. And we've come to the conclusion that there's a lot of opportunity to improve our diagnosis rate. Intellectual disability, we determine the cause in about 60% of the cases now. Birth defects about 40%, autism about 20%. So there's a lot of opportunity in all these areas to continue to improve. Approximately 20% have a genetic cause, at least at this point. We think there's probably more genetic causes that haven't been determined yet, but it shows that at least with all our technology and testing now, we still haven't made significant inroads in determining the underlying genetic mechanisms of our birth defects. There's certainly a lot of other causes. Teratogens we'll hear about a little bit later from Dr. Moore, and certainly maternal illness, and Dr. Hall talks about diabetes as being a major example of impact of maternal's health on impact of birth defects. Viruses, congenital rubella syndrome, many other causes, obviously nutrition, diet, obesity, deficiencies, folic acid would fall in this range, and impact on tooth defects, and environmental factors that are extremely complicated and difficult to determine because there's so many exposures, and trying to sort those out from an individual person with a child with a birth defect is quite complicated. To read all this, I appreciate more and more of what the CDC and everyone that's studying this has to go through. So this just is a slide that I found that just again shows all the interactions and complications. This is true for really anything we're studying, I guess, but certainly there are some genes that are known to be associated with birth defects. There are pathways, signaling pathways that are associated with birth defects, but these don't work in a vacuum. They're impacted by the environment. And I guess there's really two environments. There's the maternal environment and then the in utero environment, and those are pretty closely linked, but and certainly the in utero environment is closely impacted by the mother's environment, but there are sometimes some subtle differences. But the environment, everything from medications that the mom may be taking, both prescription and over-the-counter medications, supplements, but folate we know a lot about. We'll hear more from Dr. Oakley later. But obesity, which is a significant problem in this country and around the world, smoking, alcohol. And an area that we don't, I guess, seem to know as much about or think about is hormonal influences, and particularly on birth defects, and both hormones associated with the maternal hormonal influences, but also, I guess, environmental hormonal influences with things in the food supply and environment that we sometimes don't think about. And then the broad category of epigenetics. How does all these environmental factors play on the underlying genetic background of both the baby and the mother? So as you look at this, you can see why it's quite complicated, and maybe that's why we've only figured out it costs about 40%. So just a little bit about some of the structural birth defects. So I just pulled out, I hope it's correct, the four most common structural birth defects. One is congenital heart defects, which we'll hear about a little bit later today. Hypospadias, so abnormal placement of the opening of the urethra on the penis. Cleft lip, cleft palate, cleft lip with cleft palate, and neural tube defects. So those are the four most common birth defects or structural birth defects in the U.S. And they account for about 50% of birth defects in the U.S. Congenital heart defects, collectively, as a group, are the most common structural birth defects in the U.S., with an incidence about 80 per 10,000. Now, that's a wide spectrum of defects, from ASDs, VSDs, all the way to hypoplastic left heart and other complex congenital heart defects. Hypospadias, about 34 per 10,000 births. I wasn't aware that that was such a common birth defects. I guess we don't see many of them unless they are associated with other structural abnormalities or other complications. I guess those go to the urologist and stay there. Cleft lip or cleft palate are combinations, about 17 per 10,000. Neural tube defects now is about 6 per 10,000. Most of you know, 26 years ago, I guess, in South Carolina, that incidence was a little over 18 per 10,000, so there's been a significant improvement. I think in South Carolina, we now are down around 6 to 7 per 10,000. Varies a little bit from year to year, so we're down to where the national average is. So I'm not going to go through all the other types of birth defects, but I thought I'd at least just point out the top four. We'll talk just a little bit, and I know Dr. Oakley will talk about this more a little bit later, but neural tube defects. And in South Carolina, we capture, at least at the GDC, anencephaly, spina bifida, and cephalocyl. It looks like in a lot of other surveillance programs, anencephaly and spina bifida are captured. But just as a historical note, fortification of foods in the U.S. began in January of 1998. So looking at the 2 years prior to the fortification, 2 years after, there was about a 20% reduction. And absolutely, Dr. Oakley will give us more updates on the success, the impact of that a little later. Just put it closer to home, in South Carolina, since the neural tube defects prevention program started in 1992, I believe it was, there's been a little over 60% reduction in the incidence of neural tube defects in South Carolina. So a significant impact from that program and from folic acid and fortification. Well, I didn't mention gastroschisis in the top 4, but I will mention it just from this standpoint. Gastroschisis, which is an abdominal wall defect with the intestines extruding through that, it can have other organs as well, seems to be increasing in prevalence since the 1970s, and pulled some numbers. It looks like in a 10-year period, 1995 to 2005, there's about 3.6 per 10,000, and now in a 6-year period after that, it went up to about 4.9 per 10,000. So about a 30% increase in prevalence of gastroschisis. Interestingly, it seems to be more prevalent in younger mothers, so under 20. It also seems to have a, I guess, inverse relationship with BMI, which is a little opposite of what you might expect. With an increased BMI, there's a decreased association with gastroschisis. Might be opposite of what you might suspect. And there have been suspicion about other nutritional factors, smoking, drug use, and things like that. I'm not sure if we completely understand all the reasons behind the increase in prevalence, but that is one birth defect that seems to be increasing. And you might think, well, gastroschisis is increasing as omphalocele, another abdominal wall defect also, but it doesn't seem to have the same consistent trend as gastroschisis. So how do we know what we know about birth defects? It's through a variety of birth defect surveillance programs. And birth defect surveillance, I guess, has been around since the early 1900s, best I can tell. But I guess it was after the thalidomide epidemic in the early 60s, where thalidomide was being used as a sleep medication, and started seeing a lot of limb defects, focomelia. And after that, basically a system of worldwide surveillance systems were established to try to prevent the next thalidomide epidemic. And so that's when we started seeing, I guess, a growth of a more concerted, concentrated effort to do birth defect surveillance. And I shouldn't talk about all these, that I don't know as much about them as Dr. Moore, but the US National Birth Defects Prevention Study was established, I guess, in 1996. The data was collected through 2011 and has been a major source of information, data, and articles about birth defects, prevalence, and etiology, and hopefully prevention targets. And now there's a US Birth Defect STEPS program, study to, I can't remember that well.
Exposures.
Pregnancy exposures, yes, that's where the S comes from. So that's a major effort now to look at exposures and that during the pregnancy might cause birth defects. Locally in South Carolina, there was so we've started the neural tube defects prevention program in 1992, I believe, and certainly DHEC and DHHS and DVSN and others were significantly involved with that. From a South Carolina legislation standpoint, we had legislation in 2004 that led to the creation of the South Carolina Birth Defects Prevention Program, which began in 2006, and is continuing to go through evaluation and strategic planning process, and is now collecting data on over 50 different birth defects in South Carolina to provide some information for us. So obviously there's limitations and complications of doing all this surveillance. When you're using different state registries, they all have a little bit different inclusion-exclusion criteria of who they're surveilling and how they bring those individuals in. There's inconsistent capture of stillbirths, terminations for fetal anomalies, and duration of surveillance after birth. It's going to impact our prevalence data. There's recall bias, I guess, when you're doing interviews with families, and those that have a birth defects may have a different recall of what they were exposed to or not exposed to versus someone that is maybe a controlled population that doesn't have a birth defect. And I just mentioned this by definition, birth defects are present at birth regardless of when they're detected, so epidemiologists, I guess, say we should be using the term prevalence and not incidence. So I just put that out there so we use the correct term when we're talking about birth defects. Now this is an interesting slide I found in an article. I was just reading for this. It's from Europe. It's from the EuroCat study, and it goes up to about 2011. And I guess they were just looking at what has been the impact of birth defects surveillance programs. And the top line just shows all anomalies or birth defects. And basically what it shows is going up. So you would think if we've been doing all this surveillance for a long time and learning what the risk factors are and causes of birth defects, maybe we'd see a decrease. So it's a little concerning to me. I don't know if those numbers or slides have improved or it's different in the US versus Europe. The other interesting thing is that congenital heart defects prevalence also appears to be going up. Now, some people say, well, that's because we have better detection with ultrasound and we're just detecting them better. But there's apparently some evidence that maybe at least some of the major heart defects are actually increasing in prevalence. So I think it's another clue that we should be looking and trying to find out what is causing that. And then chromosomal birth defects are also increasing, and that is thought to be due to increasing maternal age, and as mom's age goes up, we know there's an increased risk of chromosomal abnormalities that also have associated birth defects. And this was interesting to me. I did not know this, but in Europe, I guess there's been kind of a flat line as far as the incidence of neural tube defects. So apparently in the European Union, at least at this time, none of the countries in the European Union had decided to fortify food supplies. So it's all based on, I guess, education and the mothers electing to take folic acid prior to conception. So, just in summary, birth defects are common. 1 in 33 live births are affected with a major structural birth defect. They have a significant impact, both in quality of life, but in cost to individuals, families, and society. Cause is unknown in the majority of them, so there's a lot of opportunity for us to learn more. It's complicated, and so many of the risk factors are lifestyle choices. In general, in medicine, we haven't been very successful in getting people alter their lifestyle choices as far as eating better, exercising more, sleeping more, that type of thing. So it's going to be a challenge for us to sometimes make inroads into some of the risk factors for birth defects. Socio-economic determinants, so certainly poverty, access to health care, access to medications are a major part of risk factors for birth defects, and also as a society we don't always do as well as changing those socioeconomic determinants or having an impact there. And as we saw, genetics accounts for, right now, about 20% of the causes of structural birth defects. We think there's opportunity to learn more there, but it may go beyond just simple genetic technology, but a combination of sequencing and looking at transcriptomics and methylation and metabolomics and trying to put all those together to understand it better. So I go back to this slide again, just to say it's complex. There's a lot of opportunities, but I think as we're looking to try to make inroads in understanding the causes of birth defects and preventing birth defects, we've got to go beyond just looking at gene sequencing and simple genetics. We've got to start looking at the environmental genetic interaction, and we've got to figure out how to capture the historical data that's going to help us understand some of the environmental influences, but also as our technology and testing expands, looking at how to actually interrogate those when we're seeing a child with a birth defect. So that's a quick look at the universe of birth defects. Any questions or anything?